Get that gun up!
Here's something you should know. The United States is conducting 3,500 military missions per year in Africa. That's around 10 missions a day. But if you want to know why we're there, you have to travel back to a time before the so-called War on Terror began.
Our war on terror begins with Al-Qaeda, but it does not end there.
Before President Ronald Reagan described Muammar Gaddafi as
Mad Dog of the Middle East has a goal of a world revolution, Muslim fundamentalist revolution.
Back to the Cold War era when the discovery of oil reserves off Africa's coast drew the United States' attention. That's where we need to start to understand why the US is on a continent where it's supposedly not at war. And yet at least 36 US soldiers have died there since 2001.
You heard Senator Graham there. He didn't know we had 1,000 troops in Niger. Did you?
No, I did not.
Hey fam, I'm Imaeyen, this is AJ Plus, and this Sunday we're exploring the United States military presence in Africa, its impact, and how it may actually be fueling the ever-expanding war on terror. Africa has 54 United Nations recognized countries, and whether you realize it or not, the United States presence in Niger isn't an outlier. Let me show you. The dozens of pins you're seeing right now are all locations where the United States has some sort of presence. Each pin represents a US military training, advisory or tactical deployment, partnership or base. And according to Nick Turse, a fellow at the Nation Institute, the number of pins we're seeing demonstrates a huge increase from previous years.
On any given day, generally there are somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 US troops scattered across as many as 49 countries.
He says the United States Africa Command, or Africom for short, made a 2,000% increase in the amount of missions and exercises over the course of just 1 year. If you're wondering how Africans feel about the US on the continent, don't worry. We'll get to that a little later. But right now, you need to know Africom is leading the United States efforts in Africa. We reached out to them, and in an email response to AJ Plus, Africom said, its goal in Africa is to work with partners to disrupt and neutralize transnational threats, protect US personnel and facilities, prevent and mitigate conflict, and build defense capability and capacity in order to promote regional stability and prosperity. Whew. That's not only a mouthful, but it's also an extensive to-do list. And Turse says Africom has strayed pretty far from its original humanitarian mission.
It wasn't really going to be a combatant command at all. It was more concerned with humanitarian operations. As we've seen in Niger, Somalia, Libya, there's much more going on.
So why is the United States really in Africa? Comfort Ero, the Africa director at the International Crisis Group, says the United States' presence in Africa is really a search for beneficial partnerships.
The US has had a long tradition of providing military assistance, training to a number of key African states that it sees as important allies in its own national interest.
Is the United States agenda the same as the local citizens and communities it's trying to partner with? Some don't think so.
If you ask local communities, locals see it again as sort of a new form of neocolonialism, a new form of sort of an extra sort of security blanket for the central government.
Ero says local critics view intervention by countries like the United States and France as unhelpful because Western nations support central governments that the critics dislike. Remember that, because we're going to come back to it. But before we go deeper, we need to break down the overarching theme in the United States' presence in Africa. And it's something you've heard a lot about in the last 20 years, combating terrorism. The idea of Africa being at the forefront of terrorism prevention isn't some post-September 11 revelation for the US, because before terrorism, there was oil. Africa really caught the US military's eye when huge oil reserves were discovered in the Gulf of Guinea in the 1960s. The US, which already had global footprints, was largely absent in Africa at the time.
Africa became sort of the stomping ground, and you saw sort of proxy conflicts, tensions, global tensions between Russia and China.
But the United States' presence in Africa isn't only linked to the continent's natural resources. In the late 1990s, the world saw deadly terrorist attacks in Africa, and security concerns became a part of an international narrative. The 1998 car bombing attacks against U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania were linked to Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, and the U.S. started paying attention.
There was an idea that places that were weak or fragile states, ungoverned spaces, these were areas that were going to be ripe for terrorist infiltration. And the United States pumped in, hundreds of millions of dollars in counterterrorism funding.
After the September 11th attacks, the U.S. returned to the Horn of Africa to set up its first military base in Djibouti. But Terse says the U.S. operations were ad hoc.
It was a very haphazard affair. There were training missions, but they were conducted under different authorities, under different combatant commands. Africom has centralized everything that's going on in the continent.
The United States wanted Africom to be based on the continent in Mali, but there was opposition. Remember who Reagan called a mad dog? Well, the same Libyan leader didn't want Africom in Africa, so its HQ was set up in Germany. But it was Africom that started the intervention in Libya in 2011 that eventually toppled Gaddafi. So today, Africom's presence is felt all over Africa. While Africom sees itself as an agent against security threats, Terse believes the United States intervention actually may be exacerbating the region's risk.
Over the time that the United States has poured in counterterrorism funding, sent trainers to the continent, made this a priority, there's been a growth of somewhere around 50 terrorist groups or illicit militant groups, as they're called, operating in Africa. So they've gone from 0 to 50.
The United States' current strategy focuses on building capacity and capabilities of partner countries and their militaries. It's often giving those nations large sums of money and equipment. And yet, if the goal is to create stability, then the U.S. isn't always hitting the mark. Terse says the U.S. has trained and supported militaries in countries like Burkina Faso, Chad, Niger, Mali, and Mauritania, only to have the militaries of those countries become more powerful than the governments themselves. Mali is a striking example. In 2013, rebels were on the verge of taking over the whole country. France intervened, backed by the US and African allies. But what you may not know is that the US had already been supporting Mali's military for years, and it was a US military-trained Malayan army captain named Amadou Sanogo who took over the country in a coup in 2012. And guess what? He was even more ineffective at driving back the rebels than the existing government.
Mali has been in a state of an intractable insurgency. You have what might have been the best intentions, but instead, U.S. operations in the region completely destabilized Mali.
But here's the really unnerving fact. The rebels got their weapons from the US and other Western powers who were aiding them in Libya when they were trying to overthrow Gaddafi. Those rebels took the very same weapons back with them into northern Mali, southern Algeria, Libya, and Niger, and in some cases, even used them against the US and European presence. Just so you know, this happened during President Obama's watch. And there's still another major issue with the US being in Africa. Africom may be supporting militaries who have been accused of gross human rights violations. For example, the Salak base in Cameroon is integral to the US's footprint on the continent. But it was also the site of illegal imprisonment and persistent torture, as Terse reported.
There was ongoing torture over a period of years on this base. United States troops were not implicated in the torture itself, but it seems almost inconceivable that U.S. troops on the base didn't know what was going on.
In an email response, Africom told us promoting human rights is a key aspect to the assistance they provide. They added that the law doesn't allow them or the State Department to give aid to foreign military units that violate people's human rights. And incidents like these have had a real impact.
The U.S. presence on the continent has galvanized local militants. They see the U.S. as occupying force. Because of this, the United States doesn't make any friends on the continent and often makes itself many more enemies than it actually eliminates.
In fact, a 2017 UN report determined that combating groups with these tactics makes it easier for them to recruit people into the same groups. Iro says the U.S. and foreign powers need more than a military approach.
We're not saying that there is no place for military intervention. It's necessary, but it must be bound up by a clear political strategy as well.
The future of the United States in Africa is dependent upon President Trump. And so far, his policy has been to give military generals and Africom more leeway to conduct lethal operations. But isn't this really something the public and Congress should be debating? We just spent a lot of time talking about the United States presence in Africa, and maybe you're wondering if it looks like a lot like their presence in the Middle East. Tell us what you think. Let us know what you want us to cover next. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next Sunday when we're back here with another awesome video. Thanks so much for watching.